Today we're going to talk about sample spaces. And last class we have learned the following about experiments, outcomes, and events. And so here's a review on that. Remember, an experiment is a situation involving chance that leads to results called outcomes. Remember, an outcome is the result of a single performance or a trial of an experiment. An event is one or more outcomes of that experiment. The sample space is the set of all possible outcomes. Anything that could happen. What are the possibilities of what could happen? That's a sample space. We can use tree diagrams to represent this. And we can have two-stage experiments or multi-stage experiments. Those can get kind of long. So let's do an example of a single-stage experiment. So here a coin is tossed twice. Represent the sample space for this experiment by making an organized list, a table, and a tree diagram. So for each coin toss, there are two possible outcomes. So if you tossed a coin, like in a football game or whatnot, you can toss a coin. If it falls on heads, you know which team gets to start or whatnot. Okay, so there's two possibilities. An H or a T stands for heads or tails. So if we were going to write an organized list, we could do this by writing a list. So it says pair each possible outcome from the first toss with the possible outcomes from the second toss. So we could say, okay, the first time I toss it, I could get a heads. The second time, I could also get a heads, right? What if the first time I got a tails, and the second time I also got a tails? That's a possibility. Another possibility is that the first time I get a heads, and the second one I get a tails. Or I could get tails first or heads second. Okay? So those are my possibilities. Okay, so we can write it as a list. Let's see how we could do it in a table format. It says here, list the outcomes of the first toss in the left column and those of the second toss in the top row. So we're going to go ahead and say, what if we get, both times we get heads, right? And then we could say the first time we get heads and the second time we get tails. Or we get tails and heads. I'm just filling in this table, and then both would be tails. So once again, we've got four possibilities. A tree diagram, we start off with our, we could write outcomes at the top. Outcomes. And we use like these little lines to kind of, this is what we call a tree diagram. So in the first attempt, I'm going to say first try, I could get a heads or a tails, right? Now, on my second toss, instead of getting a heads, I could get a heads or I could get tails on that second attempt. Okay? The coin that had previously gotten a tails could now give me a heads or a tails. And let's look at our third attempt. Or actually, we just had two attempts here. So now what is our sample space? So let's look at all of our four options and see what happens. Well, if our first time, we get a heads and a tails. In our second toss, the next one, let's say, okay, we got two heads here. Right? So if we see here, this is if we ended up having heads and heads twice. But the next try, we could end up having a heads and then a tails. That's our next option. Okay, so this can get kind of dicey when we have more than two tries. Okay, again, we could have tails and then a heads. Okay, so then we could have tails and then a heads. And we're just here repeating the same thing we've been talking about, how we've got four possibilities. This time we could possibly get a tails and a tails. Okay? So in the end, we have 4 possible situations, 4 possible outcomes. Okay, that's our sample space.